Let's dive into the life of Frank Lucas. This guy was a drug lord who built a serious empire in 1970s Harlem, and we're using his Wikipedia article to guide us. So get ready for a wild ride. Now, Lucas wasn't your average gangster. He's known for saying he skipped the mafia middlemen and got his heroin straight from the Golden Triangle.
Yeah, that's what makes Lucas so interesting. He didn't want to play by the mafia's rules. Instead, he went right to the source, the Golden Triangle, that region in Southeast Asia, notorious for opium production. It was like a lawless zone, perfect for someone like Lucas to operate under the radar. And this wasn't just about getting cheaper heroin. By going around the mafia, Lucas showed everyone how weak their system was, and that had ripple effects on organized crime in the U.S. for years.
Wow, so his actions had a way bigger impact than just his own business, huh? Okay, so I've heard stories about how he smuggled heroin in coffins of American servicemen coming back from Vietnam. It's a pretty dark image.
Yeah, that story was in the movie American Gangster, but it's been disputed. Lucas's supposed partner, Leslie Ike Atkinson, denied it ever happened.
So the coffin thing's a bit of a mystery. Either way, Lucas's path from a small town to a big-time kingpin is fascinating. Let's go back to his childhood in Grange, North Carolina. He grew up in the rural South during the Jim Crow era. Lucas claimed witnessing a horrible event as a kid steered him toward crime.
Right, he said that seeing his 12-year-old cousin murdered by the Ku Klux Klan was a turning point for him. He accused his cousin of hitting on a white woman. You can understand how an experience like that would mess someone up.
It's tough to imagine the kind of impact that would have, and things didn't get much easier for him as he got older. He had a run-in with a former employer, and it ended in violence, theft, and arson. Not exactly model citizen behavior, right? His mom, worried sick about him, told him to leave North Carolina, which is how he ended up in Harlem.
And that's where he supposedly met Bumpy Johnson, the notorious gangster. Lucas always said he was Johnson's driver for 15 years, but people have questioned that. Even Johnson's widow disputed how close they actually were.
So even his early days have some conflicting stories. But whether he worked closely with Johnson or not, Lucas clearly figured out how to navigate the criminal world. After Johnson died, Lucas set his sights on the drug trade. He realized quickly that he'd need to outsmart the mafia families. They were the ones controlling the heroin coming into New York. So that's where his trip to Bangkok becomes super important.
You got it. That trip changed everything. He met Leslie Ike Atkinson there, the guy who was said to have connections with opium growers in the Golden Triangle. That meeting was a turning point for Lucas. He realized he could cut out the mafia completely and get heroin straight from Asia.
So he teams up with Atkinson, and because he was such a good strategist, he saw this as an amazing chance. Getting rid of the middleman meant he could control it all, the quality, how much, and most importantly, the price.
Exactly. That's what led to Blue Magic, his infamous brand of heroin. What made it stand out was its purity. It was almost 100% pure.
Wow, so what did that do to the drug market at the time?
Well, think about it. Back then, most street heroin was cut with all sorts of stuff. But Lucas's product was way stronger. So it was more desirable and, of course, way more dangerous. This meant he could charge more and build a loyal customer base, sadly.
So he was making serious money then. I heard he was pulling in $1 million a day at one point.
Now, while that is impressive, I think we should be a little skeptical of that number. Even Lucas himself admitted later that it was an exaggeration. But there's no doubt he made a ton of money. Real estate, a massive ranch in North Carolina, even a breeding bull worth a fortune.
That's a classic rags to riches story, just with a really dark side. But here's what's interesting. Even with all that cash, Lucas didn't show it off. Why was that?
Lucas was smart. He knew that flashing your wealth would attract attention you didn't want, like from the police. He dressed simply and liked to stay under the radar. He understood that it was important to not draw attention to himself. Lucas wasn't your typical flashy gangster. He was more of a businessman who knew how to stay in the game.
He was playing the long game, which makes his downfall even more crazy. In 1975, it all came crashing down. Picture this, a cold January morning. Lucas is at his home in Teaneck, New Jersey, probably having a cup of coffee when, bam, a DEA task force busts through the door.
It was a carefully planned raid, years in the making. The Z Team, a special task force, had been working hard. They were infiltrating Lucas's network, gathering evidence, building a case against him.
So they finally had enough to get him. What happened during the raid?
They took a bunch of cash, almost $600,000. But Lucas always insisted there was way more. Millions stashed in the attic that the officers took for themselves. We might never know what really happened that day. But the raid was the beginning of the end for Lucas's empire.
Sounds like something out of a movie. So this arrest leads to one of the most ethically tricky parts of Lucas's story, his decision to work with the authorities. He turned informant. What are your thoughts on that?
It's definitely a controversial move. He gave him everything, his whole operation, names, the whole 9 yards. In exchange, they gave him a lighter sentence and protection for him and his family.
Wow, I didn't see that coming. Lucas turning informant adds a whole new layer to this. But before we get into that, let's look at what happened because of his cooperation. I understand it led to a lot of drug-related convictions.
Yeah, his testimony was a big reason why over 100 people were convicted on drug charges. It was a huge blow to the drug trade. But, Lucas Freedom didn't last. In 1984, he got into trouble again. He was caught trying to trade heroin and cash for cocaine.
It seems like some habits are hard to break. What happened next?
He was sentenced to another 7 years in prison. It just goes to show how hard it is to get away from that life, even for someone who had it all. Money, power, success. Lucas's story is a powerful example of how crime can trap you and how hard it is to escape.
It shows that even the people at the top can fall. But before we move on to his later years and talk about American Gangster, let's think about something that often gets overlooked: his family life. How did he balance being a drug lord with being a husband and a father? This isn't something people talk about a lot, but it gives us a different perspective on him.
You're right. That is an interesting and often ignored part of his life. Lucas was married to Julie Ferret. She was also convicted for her role in his drug empire and went to prison. They had a complicated relationship. They even lived apart for a while. But eventually, they got back together and stayed married for decades.
That's wild. Their story says a lot about the crazy relationships that happen in organized crime. The loyalty, the sacrifices, the secrets. It reminds us that behind all the headlines and the drama, there are real people living really complicated lives. And Lucas was a father, too. He had 7 children. It's difficult to picture a ruthless drug lord as a family man.
It's this kind of contradiction that makes you ask a lot of questions. What was it like for his kids growing up with that legacy? How did he handle the moral compromises and all the secrets he had? We may never know the answers to these questions, but they're important for understanding who Frank Lucas really was, as a complete person.
Yeah, it definitely adds another layer to his story. And speaking of complex stories, we got to talk about American Gangster. The movie from 2007 with Denzel Washington as Lucas, it brought his story to a whole new audience.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It was a huge hit. And Lucas was actually involved in making it. He even gave Denzel Washington tips on how to hold a gun. Talk about authenticity, right?
Pretty interesting, huh? But the movie caused a lot of controversy, too. Some people said it made Lucas look too good, like some kind of hero fighting a corrupt system. But like we talked about, the reality was way more complicated.
And there were things that weren't even true in it, right? Oh, absolutely. Former DEA agents who worked on the case sued Universal. They said the movie made them look bad and twisted the truth. Even Lucas admitted that only a little bit of the movie was accurate.
So American Gangster might be a fun movie. But we gotta remember that Hollywood changes things. It makes you wonder how much we can trust movies about real people and events.
It's a good reminder to be critical of what we watch and read, especially stuff based on real events. We have to look deeper and try to get different perspectives.
Speaking of perspectives, Lucas's legacy is a mixed bag. He was a ruthless criminal who made money off other people's suffering, no doubt. But he also helped the authorities take down a big part of the drug trade.
Yeah, it's that duality that makes him so fascinating. He represents those contradictions in human nature, capable of doing terrible things, but also unexpectedly cooperating with the law. He's hard to put into a neat category, and that's what makes his story so interesting.
He had a long life. He passed away in 2019 at 88 years old. His story really reflects a crazy time in American history, when drugs were everywhere and organized crime had a lot of power.
And it makes us think about some hard truths about race, poverty, and the systems that can keep people trapped in a cycle of crime. Lucas's story still resonates today because it forces us to look at all the things, the complicated things that contribute to someone like him rising to power.
It leaves you with a lot to think about. Lucas might be gone, but his impact is still felt in pop culture, in how we understand the drug trade, and in the ongoing debate about criminal justice reform.
It's amazing how Lucas's life connected with so many important events in America. The Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement, the war on drugs. He was both shaped by these events and helped shape them.
Yeah, exactly. His life was a mix of ambition, betrayal, and ultimately facing the consequences of breaking the law.
Lucas's story challenges us to look beyond what's obvious, to think about the things in society that lead to organized crime, and to really grapple with the tough ethical questions about law enforcement. It's a story that, even though it's about dark stuff, shows us the human condition and all its messy and captivating reality.
So, as we're wrapping up our deep dive into the life of Frank Lucas, what are some of the key things we should remember?
Well, I think it's important to realize that Lucas's story isn't just about him. It's a reflection of a specific time and place in American history, a time when it was hard to tell right from wrong, and when people were willing to do anything for power and money.
And for you personally, what stands out as particularly insightful or interesting from everything we've learned?
You know, what really gets me is how Lucas shook things up in the drug trade. His willingness to go straight to the source, the Golden Triangle, was a total game changer. It exposed how weak the Mafia's control was, and it had lasting effects on organized crime.
That's a good point. It shows how strategic he was and how he knew how to take advantage of opportunities. But we can't forget about all the damage he caused. The lives lost, the families broken, the communities destroyed by addiction.
Absolutely. We have to acknowledge the human cost of his crimes. And while American Gangster might have made him look glamorous, it's important to remember the truth.
And to always look for different perspectives. To question the stories we're told. Frank Lucas's story is a reminder that the truth is usually messy and complicated. There are no easy answers, only tough questions.
That's a perfect way to put it. Lucas's life was a paradox, a mix of ambition and ruthlessness, success and destruction. It's a story that still fascinates and challenges us. It makes us question our assumptions and reminds us of the power of human ambition, for good or bad.
That's a good place to stop for today. But before we go, I've got one last question for you. After everything we've learned, how would you answer this? Was Frank Lucas a product of his environment? Someone who came from poverty and racism and built his own empire? Or was he just a heartless criminal who took advantage of the system for himself?
Wow, that's a tough one. It deserves a lot of thought. I don't think there's a simple answer. There's probably a bit of both. His experiences with poverty, racism, and violence definitely influenced his choices. But we also have to hold him responsible for his actions and the harm he caused. In the end, I think it's up to each person to think about those questions and come to their own conclusions.
Well said. And to our listener, we encourage you to keep exploring this story and what it means. Learn more about the drug trade, the criminal justice system, and the things in society that contribute to crime and poverty. Frank Lucas might be gone, but the conversation about his legacy and what it means for us continues. Keep asking questions, stay curious, and never stop learning. It's amazing how one person's life can be a part of so many big moments in history, and how it can make people argue and debate. So, as we wrap up our deep dive into Frank Lucas, what's the one thing you hope our listeners will remember from all this?
Well, I hope they understand that even though Lucas's story is really interesting, it's not that unusual. It shows us bigger problems in society, like poverty, racism, and people wanting to get rich quick. These things create a world where people like Lucas can become powerful.
You're so right. It's easy to get caught up in the excitement of his rise and fall, but we can't forget the bigger picture. What do you think, listener? Does learning about Frank Lucas change how you see the drug trade? Or organized crime? Or even the American dream? We'd love to hear your thoughts.
We really encourage you to keep learning. Read more, do your own research, and form your own opinions. This deep dive was just the beginning. It was like a peek into a complicated world.
And remember, there are always different sides to every story. Keep asking questions, be curious, and never stop learning.
That's what's great about learning. It never ends. There's always something new to find out.
Thanks for taking us through this deep dive. It's been really eye-opening to learn about such a fascinating person from American history.
It was my pleasure. And to everyone listening, keep diving deep.